September 14th, 1944. The Café Odeon in Bern, Switzerland. Cigarette smoke hung thick in the air as William Sullivan sat alone at a corner table, methodically stirring his third coffee of the morning. To anyone watching, he was just another businessman waiting for an appointment that would never come. But folded inside his newspaper was a document that would soon send shockwaves through the highest levels of Nazi Germany. And the most remarkable thing about it was that every word was a lie. Sullivan wasn't supposed to be remarkable. At 34, the former insurance investigator from Philadelphia had joined the Office of Strategic Services more out of patriotic duty than any particular talent for espionage. He spoke adequate German, knew his way around financial records, and possessed what his OSS superiors called an accountant's mind for detail. But in the autumn of 1944, those unremarkable qualities were exactly what Alan Dulles, the OSS station chief in Bern, needed for an operation so audacious it bordered on madness. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Convince the Nazi high command that the Allies had broken their most secure communications codes. Not through actual code breaking. That was already happening at Bletchley Park, though the Germans didn't know it, but through a carefully orchestrated campaign of deception that would exploit the Third Reich's greatest vulnerability. After the failed July 20th assassination attempt on Hitler, paranoia had metastasized through the Nazi leadership like cancer. Officers suspected each other. The Wehrmacht distrusted the SS. The SS suspected everyone. Hitler himself saw traitors in every shadow. Sullivan's mission was to give that paranoia something tangible to feed on. To plan evidence so convincing that the Germans would tear their own intelligence apparatus apart, trying to verify it. To make them believe their enemies knew everything, troop movements, supply routes, strategic plans, not through human agents, but through broken codes. The beauty of the operation was its self-perpetuating nature. Every measure the Germans took to secure their communications would create more chaos. Every investigation would breed more suspicion. Every arrest would prove that the conspiracy went deeper than anyone imagined. What Sullivan couldn't have known, sitting in that Swiss café with his forged documents and carefully rehearsed lies, was how catastrophically effective his operation would become. Or how many German officers would die not from Allied bullets, but from their own side's paranoid fury. The first seeds were planted through Switzerland's shadowy network of intelligence brokers, men who sold information to whoever paid the highest price. Sullivan's contacts were carefully chosen, known to German intelligence but not trusted, compromised enough to seem desperate but credible enough to be taken seriously. Through them, he began feeding a steady stream of intelligence that the Germans would find disturbing for one specific reason. It was information they knew the Allies shouldn't possibly have. On September 18th, a coded message reached the Abwehr station in Bern containing detailed movements of the 352nd Infantry Division near Aachen. Information accurate down to the battalion level, including the name of a recently appointed company commander whose assignment hadn't been formally reported yet. The intelligence officer who received it felt his stomach tighten. The information could only have come from three sources: a highly placed traitor, an impossible coincidence, or intercepted communications. Sullivan had been meticulous. The intelligence he leaked was real, drawn from actual Allied sources, but he'd added subtle distortions that pointed away from human intelligence. A radio transmission timestamp that was off by 12 hours. A reference to units by their radio call signs rather than official designations. Technical details about communication protocols that a human spy wouldn't know or care about. Each carefully placed fingerprint suggested the same terrifying conclusion. The Allies were reading German military radio traffic. By October, similar reports were flooding into Berlin from multiple sources. Each one corroborated the others in ways that seemed impossible to fabricate. The pattern was unmistakable to German counterintelligence analysts already primed by months of post-assassination paranoia. On October 7th, SS Obergruppenführer Ernst Kaltenbrunner, head of the Reich Security Main Office, ordered a comprehensive investigation into signals security across all Wehrmacht and SS communications networks. The investigation itself became the weapon. Signals officers were pulled from frontline units for interrogation. Communications equipment was seized for examination. Radio operators were arrested on suspicion of sabotage. The Gestapo descended on cipher bureaus with the same ruthless efficiency they'd applied to hunting the July 20th conspirators. And with each arrest, each interrogation, each frightened confession extracted under torture, the phantom conspiracy grew more real. Major Ernst Hoffmann, a career signals officer with the 7th Army, was among the first to be arrested. His crime: using an outdated codebook after new ones failed to arrive due to Allied bombing of supply lines. Under interrogation, he confessed to deliberately using compromised codes. Not because he had, but because his interrogators already believed he had, and confession was the only path to stopping the pain. His testimony implicated 3 other officers. Their interrogations implicated 6 more. The web grew. What the Germans couldn't see was that they were creating their own crisis. Sullivan hadn't needed to identify real traitors because the investigation's mere existence guaranteed it would find them. In a system built on fear and suspicion, where denunciation was a survival tool and torture extracted whatever confessions were desired, the guilty parties wrote themselves into existence. By November 1944, the chaos Sullivan had engineered began manifesting in ways even he hadn't anticipated. German communications discipline, once legendary, started to collapse. Units changed radio frequencies hourly, making coordination nearly impossible. Encoded messages went unread because receiving units didn't have the new cipher keys. Critical orders were delayed by days as they went through multiple verification procedures designed to prevent compromised communications. The 11th Panzer Division, repositioning near Metz, received 3 contradictory sets of orders in a single day, all legitimate, all from properly authorized commands, but each issued by officers who no longer trusted the other's communication security. The division effectively paralyzed itself, trying to comply with all 3. During the critical Battle of Metz in November, this confusion contributed to defensive failures that cost German forces the city weeks earlier than necessary. Sullivan monitored the chaos from his Swiss station through decoded German messages, the real ones that Bletchley Park was actually reading. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Germans were destroying their own communication security to protect against a breach that existed, but that they'd never discovered. They were hunting for traitors who'd revealed their codes while the actual codebreakers at Bletchley continued their work undetected. But the operation took an unexpected turn in January 1945. An actual Allied agent, a French resistance operative codenamed Victoire, was captured in Strasbourg carrying legitimate intelligence materials, including what appeared to be partially decoded German messages. Under Gestapo interrogation, Victoire was asked specifically about Allied code-breaking capabilities, because by January, that's what every German counterintelligence officer was obsessed with. Victoire knew nothing about Sullivan's operation. She'd never heard of systematic Enigma compromise. But when your interrogators are convinced you know something and are willing to do anything to make you confirm it, eventually you tell them what they want to hear. She confirmed that the Allies had broken German codes. She revealed that the information had been flowing for months. She identified German officers as unwitting sources, names she'd heard mentioned in other contexts, now reframed as conspirators. The effect was catastrophic. Victoire's testimony, extracted through torture and completely false, nevertheless corroborated every aspect of Sullivan's fabricated conspiracy. To German investigators, this was the proof they'd been seeking. An enemy agent had confirmed it. The breach was real. What followed was a purge that consumed the Wehrmacht's signals intelligence apparatus. Between January and March 1945, 47 senior communications officers were arrested. 16 were executed after summary courts-martial. The others disappeared into concentration camps. Entire signals units were disbanded and rebuilt from scratch. Millions of Reichsmarks worth of communications equipment, desperately needed for the collapsing defense, was destroyed and replaced based on the assumption it had been compromised. The operational impact was immediate and devastating. During the Battle of the Bulge, German radio traffic became so chaotic that some units reverted to motorcycle couriers, losing the speed advantage radio coordination provided. When Allied forces crossed the Rhine in March, German defensive responses were delayed by hours as officers waited for verified orders through communication channels that no longer functioned efficiently. Generaloberst Alfred Jodl, chief of Wehrmacht operations, noted in a January 1945 diary entry later captured by Allied forces, "We are fighting 2 wars, one against the enemy at our gates and another against the ghosts in our own communications. I no longer know which is more deadly." But the human cost extended beyond tactical failures. Among those arrested was Oberst Friedrich Weber, head of signals for Army Group B, a career officer with no connection to any resistance movement. His crime was being responsible for communications that had somehow been compromised. Under Gestapo interrogation, he maintained his innocence. They didn't believe him. He was executed on February 12, 1945, leaving behind a wife and 3 children. Weber's last letter, smuggled out by a sympathetic guard and preserved in archives, revealed the paranoid logic that consumed the investigation. They tell me I am a traitor, though I have never betrayed anything. They say the enemy knew our secrets, therefore someone must have given them. I was responsible for the codes, therefore I am guilty. The logic is circular and perfect, and admits no innocence. Sullivan learned of Weber's execution through intelligence reports. The news affected him in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd expected chaos, confusion, operational disruption, all legitimate tools of warfare. But he'd triggered something darker. A self-consuming purge where the guilty were manufactured to fit the crime. The operation had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations and beyond his control. By March 1945, as Germany collapsed on all fronts, Sullivan's phantom conspiracy had taken on a life entirely independent of his actions. German officers genuinely believed their codes had been broken. They reorganized entire communications networks around this false belief. They executed colleagues based on confessions extracted through torture. They saw confirmation everywhere because they were looking for it. The most remarkable aspect was that even the genuine Allied code-breaking remained undetected. While German counterintelligence tore itself apart hunting for traitors who'd revealed their codes, the actual cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park continued reading Enigma traffic without interruption. The Germans were so convinced they'd found the breach that they stopped looking for the real one. In April 1945, as Allied forces overran German headquarters and captured intelligence archives, the full scope of what came to be known internally as Operation Paranoia became clear. The chaos Sullivan had triggered with his forged documents and carefully planted intelligence had cascaded through the German command structure like a virus. Communications breakdowns had contributed to tactical defeats across the Western Front. The purge of signals officers had decimated institutional knowledge. The constant security procedures had slowed decision-making at every level. A post-war analysis by British intelligence, still classified until 1982, estimated that Sullivan's operation had reduced German command efficiency by approximately 15 to 20% during the war's final 6 months. A staggering impact for what began as one man in a Swiss café with fake documents. But the moral weight of the operation haunted Sullivan. In a sealed deposition given to OSS investigators in 1952 and declassified only in 2009, he reflected on what he'd unleashed. I gave them the knife and pointed to where to cut. But they chose to cut their own throats. They chose to torture their own officers. They chose to execute men whose only crime was being responsible when things went wrong. I exploited their paranoia, but I didn't create it. The machinery of totalitarian suspicion was already there. I just found the right button to push. The deposition revealed Sullivan's ambivalence about his commendations and classified medals. He'd been devastatingly effective, perhaps the most successful psychological warfare operator in the European theater. But unlike soldiers who could see their enemies clearly, Sullivan had wielded a weapon that killed through indirection, through manipulation, through exploiting the human tendency toward fear and suspicion. One detail from captured German archives particularly troubled him. A Gestapo report from March 1945 describing the interrogation of a signals officer who, after days of torture, finally confessed to being part of the conspiracy. The report noted that the officer kept insisting he was innocent, that he didn't know what they wanted him to say, that he'd served Germany faithfully for 20 years. The interrogators concluded he was simply a trained liar. He was shot the next day. Sullivan later learned the officer's name. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, 42 years old, father of 2. Nothing in Richter's file suggested any connection to resistance activity. His confession, extracted under duress, had been entirely fabricated to end his torment. But it was detailed enough to implicate 4 other officers, who were arrested and interrogated in turn. The web grew. Perhaps most remarkably, the Germans never discovered the deception. Even after the war, surviving Wehrmacht intelligence officers remained convinced the Allies had broken their codes earlier and more completely than was actually the case. Soviet interrogators questioning captured German signals officers in 1945 to 46 found them uniformly convinced of massive code compromise that had never occurred. The psychological operation had been so successful that its targets never learned they'd been deceived. They died believing in a conspiracy that existed only because they believed in it. In the twisted logic of psychological warfare, Sullivan had created a truth through the sheer force of manufactured evidence and exploited paranoia. In 1968, 3 years before his death, Sullivan gave an unpublished interview to a CIA historian. Asked if he would conduct the operation again knowing what he knew now, he was silent for nearly a minute before responding. "In war, we do terrible things to terrible people. That's the job. But this operation worked precisely because the Nazi system was built on suspicion, fear, and the willingness to torture and execute on mere suspicion. I didn't create those qualities, I weaponized them. Would I do it again? Yes. Does that make it right? I've spent 23 years trying to answer that question." The café in Bern where Sullivan sat that September morning still exists, its brass and wood interior largely unchanged. A small plaque outside mentions the city's history as a neutral ground for wartime intelligence operations, but it makes no mention of the specific operations conducted there. The table where Sullivan sat is occupied today by tourists and business travelers who don't know that a carefully folded newspaper once rested there containing lies precise enough to topple an intelligence apparatus. The weapons of that war have long since rusted. The tanks are museum pieces. The aircraft are restored relics. But the psychological weapon Sullivan deployed, manufactured evidence, exploiting systemic paranoia to trigger self-destruction, remains as relevant today as it was in 1944. In an age of information warfare and digital deception, his operation stands as both a masterpiece of psychological manipulation and a warning about the fragility of truth in systems built on suspicion. The Germans laughed at many Allied tactics in the early war years, laughed at American fighter pilots, at British bombing accuracy, at Soviet tactical sophistication. But no one laughed about Sullivan's operation because no one knew it existed. They were too busy executing each other for crimes that had never been committed, hunting traitors who'd never existed, and tearing apart their own communications infrastructure to prevent a breach they'd never actually suffered. In the final accounting, Sullivan received commendations he couldn't discuss, medals he couldn't wear, and credit for an operation whose existence remained classified for decades. But the 47 German officers executed based on his manufactured evidence received nothing. No exoneration, no acknowledgement, no historical footnote explaining they died for a conspiracy that existed only in the paranoid imagination of a dying regime. That imbalance troubled Sullivan until his death in 1971. His classified service record, opened to researchers in 2015, contained a handwritten note in his personnel file dated 1954. "The most effective weapon isn't always the most moral one. I proved that. The Germans proved that. And history will keep proving it. God forgive us all." The thunder of artillery has long since faded from Europe's skies. But the echo of Sullivan's operation, the demonstration that an enemy's paranoia can be weaponized against itself, that carefully crafted lies can be more devastating than any bomb, and that the most brutal violence is sometimes the kind we inflict upon ourselves, still resonates through the corridors of intelligence agencies that study his work as a case study in psychological warfare. One man, one café, one carefully constructed lie. And 47 deaths, countless tactical failures, and the systematic dismantling of an intelligence apparatus through nothing more than exploited fear. Sullivan sparked the panic. But the Nazi high command provided all the fuel needed to sustain the fire until it consumed them completely.